Welcome to Have You Read It? The channel where we bring books to life, one summary at a time. Whether you're here for self-help, personal growth, or business inspiration, there's something for everyone. Today, we're diving into Mark Manson's counterintuitive and often hilarious self-help book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. This book isn't your typical self-help fare. It doesn't promise rainbows and unicorns. Instead, it offers a refreshing dose of reality, urging us to embrace our limitations, accept our flaws, and choose our struggles wisely. The book kicks off with the story of Charles Bukowski, a poet who spent decades wallowing in rejection and self-loathing before finding unexpected success. Bukowski's story is often cited as an example of perseverance, the American dream in action. However, Manson points out the irony of Bukowski's tombstone epitaph: "Don't try." The author argues that Bukowski's success wasn't about relentless striving, but about radical self-acceptance. Bukowski didn't chase success. He embraced his flaws and wrote honestly about them. He gave a fuck about what was true to him, and that resonated with readers. This sets the stage for Manson's central argument: that our culture's obsession with positive thinking is a trap, constantly reminding us of what we lack. He suggests that true happiness comes not from avoiding negative experiences, but from accepting them. Manson introduces the feedback loop from hell, where we become anxious about our anxiety, angry about our anger, and so on. He argues that this loop is exacerbated by social media's portrayal of constant happiness and success, making us feel even worse about our own struggles. He suggests that the key is to not give a fuck about feeling bad. By accepting our negative experiences, we short-circuit the feedback loop from hell. Manson argues that giving too many fucks is detrimental to our mental health, leading us to chase a mirage of happiness based on superficial values. The author emphasizes that a good life isn't about giving more fucks, it's about giving less, focusing only on what's truly important. The author uses the story of a king trying to create a perfect life for his son to illustrate a key point: that suffering is inherent to the human condition. The prince, shielded from the world's hardships, finds life meaningless. He then seeks out suffering only to realize it too is meaningless without purpose. This prince, of course, becomes the Buddha, whose teachings emphasize acceptance of pain and loss. Manson argues that happiness is not an algorithm to be solved. Dissatisfaction is a natural part of being human, a biological imperative that drives us to improve and survive. He introduces the concept of disappointment panda, a superhero whose power is to tell people harsh truths. Disappointment panda reminds us that problems never go away, they just get upgraded. The key is to find problems you enjoy solving. He emphasizes that happiness comes from solving problems, not avoiding them. Many self-help gurus, he says, offer temporary highs that mask underlying issues, rather than addressing them directly. Manson argues that emotions are feedback mechanisms, not directives. Negative emotions are calls to action, while positive emotions are rewards for taking action. He criticizes the self-esteem movement, saying that it focuses on feeling good rather than addressing the negative aspects of ourselves. He uses the example of Jimmy, a delusional young man who feels entitled to success without putting in the work. Manson argues that true self-worth comes from acknowledging and addressing our flaws. Manson shares his own traumatic adolescence, where he was expelled from school and his parents divorced. He explains that his experiences led him down a path of entitlement, seeking validation in unhealthy relationships. He argues that we are all responsible for our own experiences, even those we didn't choose. Manson tells the story of Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese soldier who continued fighting World War II for decades after it ended because he refused to believe it was over. He also tells the story of Norio Suzuki, who found Onoda only to die a few years later, chasing a different, impossible quest. Manson uses these stories to illustrate the importance of choosing our struggles wisely and finding meaning in our suffering. He argues that we should ask not, "How do I stop suffering?" But why am I suffering? For what purpose? Manson discusses the self-awareness onion, suggesting that self-awareness has layers: understanding our emotions, understanding why we feel certain emotions, and understanding our values. He emphasizes that our values determine our problems, and thus the quality of our lives. He critiques self-help gurus who focus on short-term emotional fixes rather than addressing underlying values. He explores the story of Dave Mustaine, the guitarist kicked out of Metallica right before their rise to fame. Despite creating a successful band, Megadeth, Mustaine still considered himself a failure because he compared himself to Metallica. Manson contrasts this with Pete Best, the drummer fired from the Beatles, who found happiness in family life. The author uses these examples to show how different values and metrics lead to different outcomes. Manson criticizes common shitty values, such as pleasure, material success, always being right, and staying positive. He argues that these are poor metrics for a fulfilling life and lead to unsolvable problems. He offers examples of good values, such as honesty, vulnerability, and curiosity, which are internally driven and more controllable. He discusses the importance of taking responsibility for our lives. Manson uses William James's story, a sickly young man who turned his life around by taking complete responsibility for everything, to illustrate this point. He differentiates between fault and responsibility, arguing that while we're not always at fault for our problems, we're always responsible for how we respond to them. He uses his own experience of being cheated on to illustrate this point. He argues that we are all wrong about everything, and that's okay. Growth is about becoming less wrong over time. He uses the example of cartographers believing California was an island to illustrate how beliefs change. He encourages embracing uncertainty and doubt, arguing that certainty is the enemy of growth. Manson discusses the story of Meredith Moran, who falsely accused her father of abuse, to highlight how our memories and beliefs can be unreliable. He suggests that we should question our own intentions and motivations and be skeptical of our certainties. He argues that challenging our beliefs is the only way to progress. He introduces Manson's law of avoidance. The more something threatens your identity, the more you will avoid it. He uses examples of people avoiding opportunities because they fear challenging their self-image. The author discusses the importance of failure in the process of growth. He explains that his early failures in the job market ultimately led him to embrace entrepreneurship. He uses the example of Picasso, who continued creating art throughout his life, to show that a focus on process, rather than outcome, leads to lasting fulfillment. Manson argues that avoiding failure is something we learn, often from our education system or parents. He uses Dabrowski's research on World War II survivors to show that suffering can lead to positive transformation. Dabrowski argued that negative emotions are often part of the necessary pain of psychological growth. Manson encourages embracing the pain of growth rather than numbing it with distractions. He explains the do something principle, arguing that action isn't just the effect of motivation, but also the cause of it. He relates how forcing himself to do something, even small tasks, helped him overcome procrastination and build his business. Manson highlights the importance of saying no and setting boundaries. He uses his experience traveling the world to illustrate this point. He explains how Russian culture, with its emphasis on blunt honesty, forced him to re-examine the superficial politeness common in Western cultures. He argues that rejection, both giving and receiving it, is a crucial life skill, and that avoiding it leads to a valueless life. Manson critiques the romanticized notion of love, arguing that Romeo and Juliet are a cautionary tale, not a love story. He differentiates between healthy and unhealthy love. Unhealthy love is about escaping problems through each other, while healthy love is about acknowledging and addressing problems together. The author discusses boundaries, defining them as the delineation between two people's responsibilities for their own problems. He argues that entitled people either expect others to solve their problems or try to solve everyone else's problems. He uses the example of his wife asking how she looks to illustrate the importance of honesty in a relationship. He argues that conflict is necessary for trust and intimacy. He discusses the issue of cheating, emphasizing that rebuilding trust requires acknowledging the underlying values that caused the breach and building a consistent track record of improved behavior. He critiques consumer culture's emphasis on more is better, arguing that we're often happier with less. He discusses the paradox of choice, which states that having more options often leads to less satisfaction. He shares his personal journey from seeking breadth of experience to finding freedom through commitment. Manson discusses the importance of confronting our own mortality. He relates the story of his friend Josh's death and how it transformed his life. He uses Ernest Becker's work, The Denial of Death, to explore our fear of death and how it shapes our values and behaviors. Becker argued that we create immortality projects to cope with our fear of death, and that these projects often become the problem, not the solution. Manson shares his experience of sitting on a cliff in South Africa to illustrate the power of confronting one's mortality. Thanks for watching Have You Read It? Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so you don't ever miss our next book dive.